Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where we uncover the hidden, dark, and unforgettable stories of America's past. Before we dive in, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss a journey into history. Now, today we bring you a chilling tale from 1829, the story of the woman who preyed on African Americans. A dark chapter in early American history that few dare to forget. The year was 1829, and the air in the quiet towns of Delaware and Maryland was heavy with fear, though most people carried on as if nothing was amiss. But beneath the veneer of everyday life, a shadow moved through the countryside, silent and deadly, leaving despair in its wake. Her name was Patty Cannon, a woman whose reputation would etch itself into the darkest chapters of American history. She was not a name whispered in curiosity or awe, but in trembling fear, especially among African American communities, both. Free and enslaved Patty Cannon was a woman of small stature, unremarkable at first glance, but her presence carried an unspoken authority, a dangerous certainty. She had learned early in life to read people, to find weakness, and to exploit it. To the unsuspecting townspeople, she might appear as a hard-working woman running her household, or a caring neighbor. But to those who knew the truth, she was a hunter, a predator, and a figure whose cruelty knew no bounds. Her operations were clandestine, yet meticulously organized. She commanded a gang of accomplices who shared her twisted vision, men and women who were drawn to her not by friendship, but by fear and by the promise of profit. At the heart of Patty Cannon's terror was the illegal slave trade, which still pulsed through the veins of the southern states, despite growing abolitionist sentiment in some areas. African Americans were caught in a perilous limbo. Some had been freed, others had escaped from plantations, yet none were truly safe if Cannon and her gang were nearby. She would track them with a methodical patience that made the hunted feel the weight of her gaze even before she appeared. Families who had fled slavery in the hope of freedom lived in constant dread, knowing that one false move could bring Patty Cannon to their doorstep. Her tactics were brutal and calculated. She did not simply kidnap, she terrorized. She would manipulate her victims' trust, offering help and refuge to those who were desperate, only to trap them when they were at their most vulnerable. The fear she instilled was psychological as well as physical. Parents would clutch their children close, hearts pounding at every sound, knowing that even the faintest creak on a doorstep could signal the approach of the woman who preyed on African Americans. Her influence extended far beyond the immediate. Violence she inflicted. Entire communities were left in a state of anxious suspension, lives governed by the shadows she cast. Patty Cannon's notoriety had not developed overnight. She had begun in the modest towns along the Delaware-Maryland border, learning the terrain and studying the movements of free African Americans and escapees from plantations. She had a network, a system of informants and accomplices who fed her information. Farmers, shopkeepers, and others in positions of seemingly ordinary trust often became unwilling participants, passing along details of those trying to build new lives, seeking freedom and safety. Cannon's intelligence was formidable. She would strike not with brute force alone, but with a strategy that ensured her operations remained undetected for months, sometimes years at a time. Her victims were ordinary people with extraordinary courage, families who had survived slavery, who had dared to dream of freedom, would find themselves snatched from that dream, dragged back into chains, and sold into the cruelest forms of bondage. Mothers screamed as they were torn from their children. Fathers fought desperately and were crushed, and children were left to stare in horror as their world crumbled. Cannon's cruelty was not limited to profit. She delighted in the psychological torment she inflicted, in the power she wielded over life and death. Her name became a curse whispered in hushed tones, a warning, a legend, and a haunting memory all at once. The authorities of the time were ill-equipped to confront her. Some turned a blind eye, fearful of her reach and influence. Others lacked the resources or will to challenge someone so cunning. The system itself was flawed, offering little protection to those Cannon hunted. And so, she moved through the landscape like a specter, untouchable, her crimes unpunished, and her shadow stretching further with each kidnapping, each ransom, and each act of violence. She created a world in which fear itself was a form of control, and she reveled in the omnipresent tension that gripped the lives of African Americans living along the border. Yet, beyond the terror, there was a story of survival, of courage that flickered in even the darkest corners. Some who escaped her grasp would carry the memory of what they endured, whispering warnings to others, passing along lessons learned in desperation. Every act of cruelty was counterbalanced by acts of resilience, moments of defiance that showed the human spirit could endure even in the face of a woman as ruthless as Patty Cannon. But for every escape, for every small victory, there were countless lives lost, shattered by her relentless pursuit. Her story is not just one of evil, but of the fragility of freedom in early 19th century America. It is a window into a time when the line between liberty and bondage was perilously thin, when a person's life could be undone by the cruelty of a single individual. And in that landscape of fear and oppression, Patty Cannon stands as a stark reminder of the darkness that lurked behind the polite facades of small towns, the dangers that awaited those who dared to dream of freedom, and the horrifying lengths some would go to exploit the vulnerable for personal gain. Even now, looking back through the fog of time, it is almost impossible to imagine the terror she inspired. But the evidence remains, etched in court documents, in the stories passed down by descendants, and in the collective memory of communities who still recount the horrors of her reign. The woman who preyed on African Americans in 1829 was not a monster of myth, but a real, calculated, and terrifying force, and the echoes of her deeds continue to haunt the pages of American history. By the time the late 1820s rolled in, Patty Cannon's operations had grown into something almost industrial in its cruelty. What began as small, calculated acts of kidnapping had evolved into a network capable of instilling terror across multiple counties. Cannon had an uncanny ability to appear helpful, even kind, to the very people she would ultimately betray. To an African American family, starving and worn from the long days of labor, her offer of assistance seemed like a blessing. Perhaps she would help with odd jobs, give them food, or point them towards safer routes for escape. And yet, every gesture of kindness was a trap meticulously planned. She relied on a combination of guile, deception, and sheer force. Cannon's gang her trusted aides in crime would fan out along roads, rivers, and trails, learning the movements of free African Americans, and listening for whispered rumors of newly escaped slaves. Sometimes they would follow families for miles, pretending to be travelers or traders, blending seamlessly into the everyday bustle. Then, in a moment of vulnerability, perhaps when a family paused to rest or gather supplies, they would strike. The ambushes were sudden, violent, and merciless. The psychological horror of her tactics cannot be overstated. Families were often lured with promises of safety, only to find themselves bound and blindfolded, dragged into hidden rooms, cellars, and secret compartments in her properties. These rooms were cramped, dark, and filled with the echo of despair. The victims could hear muffled cries from other captives, the shuffle of chains, and the cold, deliberate footsteps of Cannon herself. Fear was weaponized, and it was relentless. Mothers wept over their children, unable to shield them from what was to come. Fathers tried to fight, only to be subdued by men who had long ago abandoned any trace of conscience. Children, too young to understand the full scope of what was happening, clung to parents whose own strength was faltering under the weight of terror. Cannon's infamy spread quietly, through whispers and rumors, because few survived encounters to tell their story publicly. But those who did spoke of her cunning. She knew how to present herself as a normal woman, plain-spoken, domestic, unassuming. A neighbor passing by her home might see her tending a garden or sewing by the window and never suspect the horrors that lay behind closed doors. To some, this very normalcy was part of what made her so frightening. Evil, they realized, could wear a familiar face, smile politely, and invite you in with the sweetest words, all while plotting your destruction. Her profits came not only from selling kidnapped African Americans back into slavery, but also from the fear she created: communities. Lived in constant anxiety. Even free African Americans, who thought they had escaped the clutches of slaveholders, moved cautiously, never trusting strangers, always wary of the next knock at the door. Cannon's reputation created a climate where freedom itself was fragile, and the notion of safety was almost an illusion. Families huddled together at night, listening for footsteps in the dark, for the creak of a wagon wheel outside, or for the low murmurs of strangers passing near their homes. Every shadow could be her shadow. Every unfamiliar voice could signal the coming of terror. That the brutality of Cannon's operations escalated as she realized that intimidation was as powerful as any chain. She would make examples of those who resisted, ensuring that word of their suffering traveled farther than the reach of her physical force alone. Rumors circulated of families found chained, of captives hidden away in cellars with little food or water, of desperate attempts to escape that ended in brutal punishment. She understood that terror was contagious. By instilling fear in one family, she affected entire neighborhoods. People began to distrust strangers automatically, to question even the most benign gestures, because the cost of misplaced trust was unthinkable. And yet, even in the darkest corners of her reign, the human spirit endured. Some victims managed to escape her clutches, slipping away under cover of night or through moments of distraction among her gang. These survivors carried with them the weight of what they had endured, but also the knowledge of her methods, the insight into her network, and the courage to warn others. Their stories, whispered quietly among communities, became a form of resistance. They taught others how to avoid the traps she set, how to recognize the signs of danger, and how to cling to hope when all else seemed lost. Cannon's influence extended beyond her immediate victims. The legal system of the time, slow-moving and often indifferent, struggled to capture her. Law enforcement had neither the resources nor, in many cases, the inclination to pursue a woman who was as cunning as she was ruthless. Witnesses feared retaliation, and evidence was difficult to obtain in an age without modern forensic tools. As a result, Cannon operated with a confidence born of impunity. She refined her methods, expanding the range of her operations and further, embedding herself in the lives of those she preyed upon. Every kidnapping was a study in cruelty and calculation. Cannon would track a family for weeks, noting routines, learning habits, and finding weaknesses. She exploited trust, sometimes even forming false friendships with her victims before revealing her true intentions. Once captured, African Americans were often transported to her hidden properties under cover of night. The terror of these journeys was immense. Families huddled together in darkness, listening to the sounds of the countryside passing by a river, a distant owl, the rattle of wagon wheels, and imagining the horrors that awaited them. Many suffered from illness, starvation, or despair even before they reached the final destination. Her operations were not limited to individuals. Cannon understood that targeting entire families magnified the terror. By kidnapping parents and children together, she ensured that the emotional toll was catastrophic. The destruction of a single family sent ripples throughout the community, undermining trust and reinforcing the climate of fear. Her ability to manipulate emotion, to prey on the most basic human bonds, made her uniquely terrifying. The psychological trauma she inflicted was as deliberate as her physical violence. A weapon as precise and deadly as any blade. But even as Cannon expanded her reach, cracks began to appear in her carefully constructed empire. Rumors of her deeds began to reach outside the immediate regions she controlled, attracting the attention of law enforcement and abolitionist advocates. There were whispers of vigilantes, of concerned neighbors willing to risk their safety to expose her crimes. And though her network was vast and her cunning formidable, the very scale of her operations meant that mistakes were inevitable. Seeds of her eventual downfall were being sown, even as she continued to haunt the lives of African Americans along the Delaware-Maryland border. By the early 1830s, Patty Cannon's name had become synonymous with fear. Tales of her deeds spread quietly yet insistently, carried along the edges of towns, whispered in churches, marketplaces, and the homes of free African Americans who had narrowly escaped her grasp. Her infamy was cemented not only by the number of lives she destroyed, but by the cruelty of her methods and the cold, calculating way she wielded terror as a tool. Those who knew her story understood that Cannon was more than a criminal. She was a force, a dark inevitability in a world already rife with oppression. Her operations had grown bolder, more sophisticated, and more horrifying. Entire families vanished without a trace. Fathers, mothers, and children were ripped from their homes, often during the quiet hours before dawn, when the world seemed safe and ordinary. Cannon and her gang moved like shadows through the night, quietly unlocking doors, cutting locks, and dragging victims into waiting wagons. The screams, muffled yet unmistakable, echoed through the stillness, but there was no one to help. The rural counties she targeted were scattered, poorly patrolled, and slow to respond. By the time anyone realized what had happened, Cannon was long gone, leaving behind only the echo of terror. Some of her most notorious acts involved those who had dared to flee plantations in hopes of freedom. Escaped slaves who had survived the dangers of flight often believed they were safe once they reached a free state. But Cannon's network was meticulous, her intelligence gathering relentless. She learned of these families' routes, their hideouts, and even the places they stopped to rest. It was a cruel irony that the very determination that allowed them to escape bondage made them targets. Cannon preyed upon their hope, exploiting the most vulnerable moments in their journey toward freedom. The impact on the communities she terrorized was profound. Parents who had once allowed children to wander afield or play near a river now clutched them tightly, fearful of strangers or sudden movements. The joyous sounds of family life were replaced with whispered warnings, secretive meetings, and the constant calculation of risk. Entire neighborhoods were paralyzed by her presence, adjusting their routines, curbing their freedom, and living under the weight of constant anxiety. Cannon had created a reign of terror that extended far beyond the individual lives she destroyed. She had transformed the very landscape of daily existence. There are accounts of her methods that chill the blood. Victims were often confined in cramped, dark rooms, sometimes for weeks, until arrangements could be made to transport them further south, sold into the expanding slave markets of the Deep South. Families were frequently separated, a deliberate tactic to maximize suffering and ensure compliance. Children cried for their parents. Parents wept over the helplessness of their children. And Cannon, cold and deliberate, watched it all unfold. Her gang carried out her orders with efficiency, but it was Cannon who orchestrated the cruelty, shaping it like a sculptor shaping stone. Every act of brutality served a purpose, whether financial gain, the assertion of power, or the simple satisfaction of domination. Despite her ruthlessness, cracks began to appear in her operation. Some neighbors, suspicious or outraged, started paying attention to the comings and goings at her properties. Travelers who noticed unusual activity reported it when possible. A few brave African Americans who survived encounters with her managed to warn others, creating networks of resistance that subtly undermined Cannon's control. It was not that her power diminished immediately, but the threads of secrecy she depended on began to fray. The authorities, long slow and cautious, were finally forced to act. Law enforcement officers, abolitionist sympathizers, and concerned citizens began piecing together reports, testimonies, and rumors. Court cases were brought forward, although evidence was difficult to obtain in a time before modern investigative techniques. Each testimony of a survivor or witness painted a grim picture of a woman who had violated every moral and legal boundary. Yet Cannon remained elusive, evading capture through cunning intimidation and her intimate knowledge of the local terrain. Cannon's psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as her physical cruelty. She often presented herself as helpful, even charitable, to unsuspecting families. This duality made her particularly dangerous. No one could predict when she might strike, and her victims could never fully trust the signs around them. By the time they realized her true intentions, it was often too late. And yet, it was this very duality that contributed to her downfall, as the contrast between her outward appearance and hidden malice created inconsistencies that could be observed, reported, and eventually exploited by those seeking justice. Even as her empire of fear expanded, the moral compass of the time began to push back. The growing abolitionist movement, coupled with the tireless work of local law enforcement in pockets of the region, started to close the net around her. People who had once been too afraid to act began speaking out. Their courage was often quiet, cautious, and fraught with danger, but it represented a counterforce to the darkness Cannon had imposed. Slowly, systematically, the web she had woven began to unravel, showing that even the most formidable cruelty could not remain unchecked forever. The stories of those she captured remained haunting. Families, once hopeful and determined, found themselves in the hands of a woman whose cruelty seemed without limit. Parents grieved as their children were torn from them, siblings were separated, and the fragile promise of freedom was ripped from their lives. Cannon's reign was not simply a series of crimes. It was a study in the systematic destruction of hope. The emotional toll, the terror, and the loss left scars that lasted generations. Survivors carried their memories quietly, passing them down in whispered warnings, in tales told to the next generation, and in the vigilance they maintained against the shadows of the past. Yet, despite the horrors, acts of courage persisted. Some managed to escape her clutches, guiding others to safety, sharing knowledge of her traps, and demonstrating the indomitable strength of the human spirit. Even in the face of overwhelming fear, communities began to organize, to plan, and to resist. They understood that survival required not only vigilance, but solidarity, and that hope, fragile as it was, could endure even under the shadow of one of America's most notorious criminals. By the mid-1830s, Paddy Cannon's reign of terror had begun to crumble. The relentless pursuit by law enforcement, combined with the courage of those who had survived her cruelty, finally caught up with her. Her empire, built on fear and exploitation, could not withstand the growing scrutiny of determined authorities and the courage of a people who refused to remain silent. For years, she had eluded capture, her knowledge of the local terrain and network of accomplices shielding her from justice. But the web of lies, deception, and brutality she had spun could not hold forever. The arrest of Paddy Cannon was not a simple affair. Authorities had to carefully gather evidence, interview witnesses who feared retribution, and coordinate across county lines. Survivors came forward, offering testimony of the horrors they had endured, and neighbors who had once turned a blind eye provided crucial information about her movements and hideouts. For the first time, the true scale of her operations was laid bare. Dozens of kidnapped African Americans, countless families terrorized, and a network of accomplices who had helped her maintain control. The weight of her crimes was overwhelming, and the public's horror was immediate. During her trial, the stories of her victims were recounted in painstaking detail. Families spoke of being torn from their homes, of nights spent in dark, cramped cells, and of the emotional torment inflicted upon them. Each testimony painted a picture of a woman whose cunning was matched only by her cruelty. Observers in the courtroom were struck by the contrast between her small, unassuming appearance and the monstrous acts described. It was a sobering reminder that evil often hides behind familiar faces, and that the greatest threats can emerge from the most ordinary-seeming places. Cannon's defense was limited. She attempted to cast doubt, to minimize her involvement, and to manipulate the perception of those judging her. But the weight of evidence, combined with the emotional impact of the victims' testimonies, left little room for doubt. The truth of her actions, laid bare in court, was undeniable. She had preyed upon the most vulnerable, exploited their trust, and inflicted suffering with meticulous calculation. The sentence was a reflection not only of the crimes she had committed, but also of the societal recognition that such terror could not go unpunished. The legacy of Patty Cannon extends far beyond her conviction. Her story serves as a stark window into a period of American history when the line between freedom and bondage was perilously thin. It reveals the fragility of security for African Americans in the early 19th century, and the lengths to which some would go to exploit that vulnerability. But it also highlights the resilience of the human spirit. Communities came together, survivors persevered, and the forces of justice, however delayed, ultimately prevailed. Even today, her name evokes fear, fascination, and reflection. It is a reminder of the darkness that can emerge in ordinary places, and of the courage required to confront it. Families who survived her attacks carried their experiences forward, teaching their children the importance of vigilance, the value of community, and the necessity of hope in the face of terror. Oral histories, records, and accounts passed down through generations keep her story alive, not to glorify her, but to remember the suffering she caused and the bravery of those who endured it. Patty Cannon's crimes also illuminate broader truths about American history. They show how the institution of slavery, the exploitation of vulnerable populations, and the complicity of those who turned a blind eye created conditions in which such terror could thrive. Her story is intertwined with the systemic oppression of the time, the moral failures of society, and the extraordinary courage of those who resisted. In understanding her actions, we also understand the environment that enabled them, and the profound human cost of that environment. For an older American audience, reflecting on Patty Cannon is an exercise in grappling with uncomfortable truths. It challenges us to acknowledge the horrors that occurred, the resilience of those who survived, and the lessons that remain relevant today. Her story is a cautionary tale, a study in cruelty, and a testament to the enduring spirit of those who fought for freedom, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Ultimately, the tale of Patty Cannon is not just about one woman's crimes. It is about the intersection of fear, power, and resistance in a society struggling with the moral and human consequences of slavery. Her capture and punishment offered a measure of justice, but the scars of her reign persisted. Families rebuilt their lives, survivors carried their memories forward, and communities remained vigilant. The dark shadow she cast over the Delaware, Maryland border may have lifted, but the lessons of her cruelty remain, etched into the collective memory of American history. As we look back on 1829 and the years that followed, we see both the depths of human cruelty and the strength of human resilience. Patty Cannon's story reminds us that evil can hide in plain sight, but that courage, community, and perseverance have the power to overcome even the most calculated and relentless forms of terror. It is a story that continues to resonate, a chapter of history that compels reflection, and a testament to the enduring struggle for freedom and justice in the face of unimaginable adversity.